The story begins in the most unexpected way. Not inside the glamorous boardrooms where fortunes are made, not in the shining skyscrapers that carry the names of powerful families, but in the quiet, echoing halls of an elite private school where the heir of one of the richest men in the country dragged his feet from class to class with the kind of exhaustion that did not come from sleepless nights of studying, but from the emptiness of failing over and over again. His name was Adrian, the only son of billionaire magnate Charles Sterling, whose empire stretched across industries from banking to technology to real estate. And yet, Adrian could not pass even the simplest algebra test. Teachers whispered about him in the staff room, shaking their heads at the irony of a boy who had the world at his feet but seemed incapable of lifting his mind to the level required of the privileged school he attended. Classmates mocked him in cruel, subtle ways. Never openly in front of his father's name, but behind his back the laughter traveled like wildfire. For Adrian, every report card was another nail in a coffin built out of disappointment, a reminder that no amount of money could purchase intelligence or discipline, and no bodyguard or chauffeur could protect him from the slow collapse of his confidence. He would sit in class, staring at pages of questions, numbers dancing in confusing patterns, history dates slipping from his memory, literature assignments sounding like foreign languages, and in those moments, he would shrink deeper, into his chair, praying the bell would ring before the teacher called his name. At home, life was not much better. His father's mansion was vast, filled with art pieces imported from Europe, golden chandeliers, and marble floors polished daily. But Adrian felt like a ghost wandering those corridors, invisible except for the moments when Charles Sterling decided to remind his son of his failures. "You are embarrassing this family," his father would roar after each failed exam, his voice booming like thunder against the high ceilings of their dining hall. His mother, elegant and graceful, would offer only silence, sipping wine with eyes that looked away, too used to wealth and social appearances to confront the truth of her son's misery. Tutors had been hired, expensive and brilliant, but none lasted long. Adrian did not lack intelligence. What he lacked was purpose, guidance, and someone who could see past the shadow of his last name. But in the silence of those long nights, when servants had retreated to their quarters and his parents disappeared into their worlds of parties and deals, Adrian lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his oversized bedroom, feeling smaller than the boy who had once dreamed of becoming someone. He didn't know then that salvation would come from a man most people in his circle didn't even notice, a man in overalls pushing a mop, a man who sang softly to himself while scrubbing floors, a man the world had labeled just a janitor. And yet that janitor carried inside him a wisdom forged from struggle, a perspective sharper than textbooks, and a secret that would change the trajectory of Adrian's life forever. Adrian first noticed the janitor, whose name was Mr. Elijah, on one of those afternoons when everything seemed to collapse at once. He had failed yet another math test, the red ink bleeding across the page like a wound, and while the teacher's voice droned on about effort and responsibility, all Adrian heard was the laughter that would surely come from his classmates once they saw his score. He rushed out of the classroom before anyone could say a word, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the polished tiles of the hallway. His chest felt heavy, his throat tight with shame, and he turned a corner too quickly, bumping into a cart stacked with cleaning supplies. The cart wobbled, a bucket nearly tipping over, but a steady hand caught it just in time. Adrian looked up, and for the first time, truly saw the man he had passed countless times before. Mr. Elijah stood tall, his hair flecked with gray, his skin weathered by years of hard work, his uniform plain and unremarkable, yet his eyes carried something that unsettled Adrian. A calmness, a knowing, as if this man saw more than what was on the surface. "Easy there, young man," Elijah said, his voice deep but gentle. And instead of scolding Adrian for nearly spilling the bucket, he simply smiled. Adrian muttered a quick apology and tried to walk past, but something about the warmth in Elijah's tone lingered with him. Later that evening, after another scolding from his father, who threw the failed test onto the dining table like a piece of garbage, Adrian found himself wandering the school grounds long after most students had gone home. The sky was turning, gold with sunset, the classrooms darkening one by one, and in the quiet he heard a faint humming echo through the hall. Following the sound, he saw Elijah again, this time mopping the floor near the library, his lips moving to an old gospel tune. Adrian stood there awkwardly, not sure why he hadn't left yet, and finally said, "You always work this late?" Elijah looked up, leaned on his mop, and chuckled. "Work doesn't end until it's done. But you know, sometimes the hardest work ain't with these floors. It's up here." He tapped his temple. Adrian frowned, not fully understanding, but something about the words pierced through his frustration. For weeks, he had been drowning in disappointment, but here was a man who seemed at peace with the world, despite standing in a role that most rich kids in Adrian's circle would consider beneath them. Instead of leaving, Adrian asked, "Were you good in school?" It was a strange question, even to him, but Elijah answered without hesitation. "I wasn't the best on paper, no. Failed more times than I can count. But life taught me something. Schools never could. And once I learned that, nothing could stop me." Adrian leaned against the wall, curious despite himself. He wanted to know more, wanted to understand how someone who wasn't born into privilege could speak with such quiet certainty. Elijah studied him carefully, reading the exhaustion in his shoulders, the fear in his eyes. "You're carrying a weight too heavy for you, son," he finally said. "But sometimes failing isn't the problem. Not knowing why you're trying in the first place, that's the real trap." Those words echoed in Adrian's head all night, louder than his. Father's anger, louder than the silence of his mother, louder even than the shame of his failed exams. For the first time, he felt a spark of curiosity, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this janitor held the kind of secret he desperately needed. The next morning, Adrian sat through classes like a body without a soul, but his mind wasn't on the chalkboard or the textbooks. It kept circling back to Elijah's words. He found himself scribbling them in the margin of his notebook. Failing isn't the problem. Not knowing why you're trying. He rolled the phrase around in his head again and again, like a puzzle that was just out of reach. By the end of the day, instead of rushing to the chauffeur waiting by the school gates, Adrian lingered behind, drifting through empty hallways until he caught sight of Elijah again. The janitor was bent over, scrubbing a stubborn stain from the floor, humming, softly the way he always did. Adrian hesitated, fighting the voice in his head that mocked him for even thinking of speaking to a janitor, the kind of voice inherited from years of growing up in wealth where service staff were background noise, invisible and unimportant. But then another voice pushed back, the voice of his own desperation, the loneliness of being a failure in a world where everyone expected perfection. That voice won. "Mr. Elijah," he said, and the janitor looked up with that same calm smile. "Mind if I talk to you for a bit?" Elijah leaned back on his mop, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing the seriousness in Adrian's tone, then nodded. "Talk away, son." And so, in a quiet corridor smelling faintly of soap and dust, Adrian began to pour out what he had never dared to tell his father, never even admitted fully to himself. He spoke of the fear that strangled him during tests, the shame of being the butt of hidden jokes, the crushing pressure of carrying a last name so heavy it left no room for weakness. He confessed how small he felt in his own home, how his mother's silence cut deeper than his father's anger, how the gilded cage of wealth only made his failures sting worse. Elijah listened without interrupting, his mop resting quietly at his side, his face unreadable yet full of presence. When Adrian finally ran out of words, his voice cracking from the weight of them, Elijah placed the mop back in the bucket and said softly, "You're looking at tests, like they're walls, meant to keep you out. What you don't see is that they're just doors. But a door don't open if you don't have the key." Adrian frowned. "And what's the key?" Elijah smiled, his eyes glinting. "Understanding yourself. Most kids study to pass, but they don't learn to understand. They don't ask why the numbers matter, why the stories matter. They chase grades instead of knowledge. You can't win that way, but if you find your why, if you understand what it means to you, then nothing can stop you. Because once you care, your brain will fight for it." Adrian had never thought of school that way. To him, tests were judgments, battles he was doomed to lose. But Elijah was suggesting they were something else entirely. Not punishments, but opportunities. He felt a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in years, though he quickly smothered it with doubt. "But I've already failed so much. It's too late for me." Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. "Too late? Son, I didn't even finish high school the first time around. You think failing makes you broken? No. Failing makes you ready to start again, this time with eyes wide open." Adrian stared at him, stunned by the simplicity and power of those words. For the first time in his life, he began to wonder if failure wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something larger. That evening, as Adrian rode home in the back of his father's luxury car, staring out the tinted windows at the blur of the city lights, he felt strangely restless. Usually, after a day of failure, he would sink into the leather seats with a mixture of shame and exhaustion, bracing himself for the cold silence of his mother and the thunderous scorn of his father. But Elijah's words wouldn't leave him alone. They spun in his head like a tune that refused to end. Tests are doors. Find the key. Failure makes you ready. For the first time in years, he wondered if maybe there was a way out of the cycle he had been trapped in. He thought of Elijah's calm confidence, of the way he spoke not like a man defeated by circumstance, but like someone who had discovered a truth far bigger than any textbook. That night, after the inevitable lecture at the dinner table and the sharp clatter of his father's fork against the plate, Adrian retreated to his room and opened his math book. Normally, the sight of equations made his chest tighten, but this time he forced himself to look at them differently. Instead of thinking about the grade, instead of fearing the red ink, he tried to ask himself the kind of question Elijah had. Suggested, "Why does this matter? What's the point?" At first, nothing changed. The numbers were still confusing, the symbols still mocking. But he kept going, fueled by the memory of Elijah's voice telling him that understanding mattered, more than chasing answers. Somewhere deep into the night, something shifted. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but when he solved one equation without glancing at the answer key, he felt a spark of satisfaction he had never experienced in school before. It wasn't about impressing anyone or proving his worth. It was about the realization that he could actually do it. He could learn. The next day, he found Elijah again, this time in the gymnasium, sweeping dust from the bleachers. "I tried," Adrian blurted out, surprising even himself. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Tried what?" "To look at things differently. To understand, not just pass. And it worked. A little." Elijah smiled knowingly, as if he had expected it all along. "That's the thing, son. Once you take the first step, the next one ain't so hard. But don't stop. It ain't about one test. It's about changing how you see yourself." For weeks, Adrian kept meeting Elijah in those quiet corners of the school. Sometimes it was by the stairwell, sometimes near the library, sometimes in the cafeteria long after the students had left. And each time, Elijah gave him not answers, but questions questions that forced Adrian to think differently about his studies, about life, about who he wanted to be beyond the sterling name. Slowly, the boy who had once dreaded classrooms began to approach them with curiosity. And though his grades didn't skyrocket overnight, something far more important was happening. He was learning how to learn. Word of his change began to spread, first among teachers who noticed he was paying attention, then among classmates who saw that the boy they once mocked was no longer shrinking in his chair. But at home, the battle was far from over. His father remained skeptical, dismissing Adrian's small improvements as irrelevant. "You'll never run this empire if you can't master the basics," Charles Sterling would sneer. Yet Adrian felt something new burning inside him, a quiet defiance, a determination that was no longer rooted in fear, but in the belief that he was capable. And that belief, fragile but growing, was the very secret Elijah had been planting in him from the start. As the weeks stretched into months, the transformation within Adrian became impossible for even the most dismissive eyes to ignore. He was still not the top student in his class, but his test papers no longer came back painted in red ink. Instead, they bore notes of encouragement, small remarks from teachers who seemed startled to see him engaging with real effort. More than once, a teacher paused mid-lesson when Adrian's hand shot into the air with a question that was thoughtful rather than desperate. The classmates who had once whispered jokes behind his back began to fall silent, confused at how the boy they had labeled as hopeless was now showing signs of resilience. Adrian himself felt like he was walking out of a fog he hadn't realized was surrounding him, a fog made of years of believing he was nothing more than the shadow of his father's empire. And at the heart of that change stood Elijah, the janitor whose presence became a kind of secret anchor in Adrian's world. They met in stolen pockets of time, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence, and the lessons Elijah gave were never about formulas or dates or vocabulary lists. They were about ways of thinking. "Son, you gotta stop looking at success as a mountain," Elijah told him once while wiping down a window streaked with fingerprints. "If you stare at the peak too long, you'll never take the first step. Success is just a path, one stone at a time. Step steady, step honest, and don't worry if you stumble, because stumbling means you're moving." Those words lived in Adrian's mind the day he sat for an exam, and for the first time in his life, felt calm. Not because he knew every answer, but because he wasn't terrified of failing anymore. The fear had lost its grip. At home, however, storms continued to rage. His father grew suspicious of the change, pressing him for explanations he could not give. "What's gotten into you?" Charles Sterling demanded one night after a business dinner, his tie loosened, his glass of whiskey half empty. "Some tutor behind my back? Some trick?" Adrian wanted to say the truth, that the wisdom came not from the elite tutors his father had thrown money at, but from the janitor his father would never even notice. But he swallowed the words, afraid that exposing Elijah would end their fragile bond. Instead, he quietly said, "I just want to try harder." Charles scoffed, uninterested in anything that didn't sound like immediate excellence. Yet while his father dismissed him, Adrian found strength in knowing a truth his father could not touch. The secret was working, not because it was magical, but because it was his. Elijah had taught him that dignity wasn't in the name you carried, or the wealth you were born into. It was in the choices you made when no one believed in you. That belief grew stronger the night Adrian saw Elijah sitting alone on the school steps after hours, staring out at the horizon with a faraway look. "You ever regret this job?" Adrian asked cautiously, sitting beside him. Elijah smiled faintly. "Regret? No. Every path has its own lessons. I may not wear a suit, but I've seen things those men in suits will never understand. Life gave me storms, and I learned to dance in the rain. That's what I'm passing to you." not answers, just a way to face whatever storm comes. And as the two of them sat under the darkening sky, Adrian realized the most life-changing secret Elijah had given him was not a formula or a strategy. It was the power to see failure not as an end, but as a teacher. It was a secret his father's billions could never buy, but one that had already begun to change everything. The turning point came in Adrian's final year, when the school announced a rigorous set of exams that would determine college placements, and for many, the path of their futures. The announcement sent waves of panic through the student body, but Adrian found himself unusually calm. He had been preparing quietly, step by step, not with the frantic cramming of before, but with the steady mindset Elijah had instilled in him. The night before the exams, while his classmates exchanged frantic text messages and his father stormed into his room demanding flawless results, Adrian remembered Elijah's words. Success is just a path, one stone at a time. He took a deep breath, closed his books, and went to sleep, something he never could have imagined doing a year earlier. The next week, as he sat in the exam hall under the harsh fluorescent lights, something remarkable happened. He didn't feel crushed. The questions still challenged him, the numbers still required thought, but instead of spiraling into panic, he treated each one like a door waiting for the right key. He paused, thought, and when he didn't know an answer, he kept moving forward without fear, knowing failure was no longer his enemy. When the results came weeks later, Adrian's name wasn't at the bottom anymore. He wasn't the top of the class, but he had passed every test respectably, shocking teachers, silencing classmates, and most of all, stunning his father. Charles Sterling looked at the report card as if it were a foreign object, disbelief flickering across his face. "How?" he demanded. Adrian only smiled faintly, refusing to betray Elijah's trust. For once, he didn't need his father's approval to feel proud. He had earned something greater, his own belief in himself. The day after graduation, Adrian searched for Elijah, wanting to thank him, but the janitor was nowhere to be found. His cart was gone, his uniform replaced by another man's, and no one seemed to know exactly where he had gone. Some said he had retired, others whispered he had moved to care for family. Adrian felt a pang of loss, but also a deep understanding. Elijah had never been meant to stay forever. He had appeared in Adrian's life at the precise moment he was needed, leaving behind a legacy not of wealth or power, but of wisdom. Years later, when Adrian entered college and later began to carve his own path in business, he often thought back to the quiet man with the mop who had taught him the secret that changed everything, that failure was not the end, that understanding mattered more than grades, that success was built one step at a time. At conferences, when people asked him how the son of a billionaire who once failed every test turned his life around, Adrian never spoke of tutors or strategies or luck. He only smiled and said, "Someone once taught me that every door has a key. You just need to find yours." And though the world never knew Elijah's name, Adrian carried him in every choice, every success, every time he refused to give up. The boy who once lived in the shadows of disappointment had become a man who understood that true wealth was not measured in billions, but in the wisdom passed quietly from one soul to another, often in the most unexpected places. And that was the life-changing secret, the legacy of a janitor who saw a broken boy not as a failure, but as a door waiting to be opened.